The number of English as a second language, or ESL, students in schools has dramatically increased across the United States. In the year 2011 and 2012, over 9% of high school students alone were English second language students. That's approximately 4.4 million students in America that would not say English as their first language. In America, 26 states now either have or are implementing high-risk exit exams for high school students. All students are not only required to take these exams, but are required to pass them in order to graduate or gain a diploma. This alone poses a problem for ESL students and makes it a sink or swim situation for them. I believe that state exams should be allowed to be taken in other languages for ESL students. I'll begin by asking you whether or not you truly believe one test really concludes how proficient you are in one subject. Have you ever gotten nervous for a test? Do you ever feel like you could have done better on a test but just didn't understand the material quite well? Well, I'm sure you answered yes to at least one of those questions, and if you didn't, well, I'd rather have your brain instead of mine. How can we, as a public school system, truly be able to conclude what a student has retained in a class based solely on one examination? ESL students are required to take an English proficiency exam upon entering the public school system, also known as the TOEFL exam. This exam gives the school an idea of how well the student knows the English language and helps them place them in a proper grade level. However, this really only tests a student on how well they know the written English language. Studies have shown that it takes about 6 months to a year to proficiently learn to speak a second language. However, it can take up to 10 years to learn to read and write in a second language proficiently. That being said, how can a teacher or state be so sure on a student's capacity to learn if we're only testing them on their ability to read or write through one exam? I grew up in a small town in America in upstate New York. I was surrounded by middle-class white farmers living in their houses passed down from generation to generation. However, in one of the biggest cities nearby, called Utica, New York, ESL students were flooding into the school districts. Utica quickly rose to the third highest receiver of refugees in America, and as such I was immersed in a sea of people who didn't speak English well and didn't understand the culture as much as someone like myself. This brings me to question whether or not state exams given in English are even adequate enough to test the student's ability of a subject. While researching, I came across the story of ESL students who were taking a test for a psychology class. While taking the test, they came across a question that included the term Tupperware party. Tupperware had nothing to do with the question, but because of its placement within the question, these students were penalized not for their knowledge of the subject in psychology, but rather because of their lack of understanding of the American culture. These students, because they were comfortable enough with their teacher, were able to go up front and ask her about the question and then finish their exam. But what about those students who aren't comfortable with their teachers? Or what about the students who are taking the exam, the state exam, and are too shy to go up front and ask about something they don't understand? Culturally bound language unintentionally tests students on not just their knowledge of the subject, but on the culture itself. This causes students to take more time on their test, which can cause anxiety, making them feel overwhelmed and score poorly on their tests. Some teachers believe that we shouldn't have to modify public tests because students don't understand the culture. But what about those students who have just come to America from overseas and don't understand the nuances of American language, or the lingo or slang that students or even teachers use without even noticing it? They're being punished for things out of their control, and because of that are being looked down upon and seen as unintelligent. Just because the student does not know or understand the speech being used to explain a situation does not mean that they don't understand the concept in question. Therefore, instructors have to determine whether students should be penalized for their lack of knowledge of the culture when they potentially could understand the material being tested. Lastly, I would like to bring into question the differences in students with learning disabilities in comparison to ESL students. A learning disability is defined as, quote, a condition giving rise to difficulties in acquiring knowledge and skills to the level expected of those of the same age, especially when not associated with a physical handicap. In my unprofessional but adequate opinion, I think it would be safe to say that students whose first language is not English have, quote, difficulty acquiring knowledge and skills to the level expected of those of the same age. It's not because they're unintelligent, but rather they just don't understand the language yet. In high schools across America, students with learning disabilities are able to go into separate rooms, take tests one-on-one with teachers, and have accommodations given to them if need be. The No Child Left Behind Act actually requires that students with learning disabilities be provided appropriate accommodations and supportive aids and services in order to participate fully in state and district-wide assessment programs. If this is offered for students with learning disabilities, why are these accommodations, and more specifically, the ability to take a test in a language most comfortable and familiar to the student, not being made available to those who need it? In conclusion, I believe that ESL students should be able to take state exams in their native language. I think it's wrong for us to judge a child who's probably been through more than any one of us will ever experience and base their entire high school career and possibly future off of a state exam. The stress level, cultural differences, and matter of not fully being able to judge a student's mental capacity based on just one test should be a matter taken into consideration across schools in America.